We learned how to make a model really quickly, have a rigid body and be physical by selecting the model. Once we scale it, select it, come up here and add rigid body, and then this rigid body shows up. If we do the same for this model, which is Banana Tree by Sean Tarrant, pretty cool, Banana Tree. So if we do the same for that, so if we, let's actually remove this and I'll do it again here. So if we say Banana Tree, we'll add rigid body and then make the rigid body movable, you'll notice that our character, our gopher here, will collide with the stem. But you'll also notice, if you can see this, my computer is struggling to run all the calculations when it collides against the leaves, particularly on the bottom side, but also on the top side. And one of the challenges is that this is a very convoluted surface. It's got lots of starts and stops. It kind of comes in on itself. It's unclear where these collision points ought to be, and so it has to run the calculation numerous times, too many to get a clean collision, and we end up getting choppiness, which we do not want. And so what we're going to do is make our own rigid body out of rigid nodes or collider nodes that we will build in shapes, and they're listed here under physics. And we're going to be using these represent or replicate the entities, and they are colliders. So we can build a box-shaped collider and a sphere-shaped collider. And what we're going to do is basically do a cone for the trunk, rotate that into place, and then what I've think makes sense is to do a few spheres here that to use, and then we can just use simple planes up on the top, and we'll fuse it all together and then combine it with our mesh. So it's a bit more roundabout way, but if you do want things to be colliding with these kind of convoluted shapes, you'll need to do this little technique here. So let's begin that process. So first of all, we're going to actually remove this rigid body, make sure we don't have one, because we're going to be building our own. And so the gopher can hang out over here. So what we're going to do is, under physics, we're going to use these section at the bottom. At the top, you'll see constraints, but we're going to be working with colliders. And so we'll have a box, plane, cone. We're going to start with cone, and we're going to basically approximate our trunk here. So let's go ahead and draw a cone. Let me go ahead and bring this, make sure that this is intersecting with the ground, so I'm kind of mimicking its height. So let's do physics and cone collider. All right, so I'm going to draw one. I'm going to get approximately the bottom radius, or diameter rather, and then approximately the top. Let's actually make sure you're doing this in stop time, so that you these rigid bodies don't just tip over. So this looks blue. You see this sort of translucent blue shape, blue-looking color rather. This blue that will not that'll be invisible in present time. It won't be in play time, but it will be invisible in present time. And so right now it's kind of this aqua fresh blue. Something to keep in mind. So we need to rotate this into position. I'm going to come over to this side, I think. And I'm holding down Control. Easy does it. There. You can always do these with the numbers if it evades you. I'm going to transform. You can be like, or hold down Control if you want. Hold down Control is just kind of use the mouse wheel on that scroll bar. That looks pretty good. Maybe it could rotate in slightly this way. I like that. So that one's good. For the moment, we take this thing, it comes in, it's written as rigid node. Once we draw it, we'll go ahead and set it to its movability. It's basically just a rigid body. It's a node with a rigid body. It has a transform, position, rotation, and you can adjust all the the physics to it. But the first thing that we want to do is just make it not movable. We're going to end up fusing all the ones that we put together. All the ones that we draw here now, we're going to end up fusing together. So it's that fused item is going to be made immovable in the end. Okay, so now I'll go back to physics, and we're going to draw the bananas, which I'm going to do is basically 3 spheres, or you could go even simpler if you're not depending on your kind of level of perfection. I'm going to draw them here on this side and rotate them into position. When I draw against this rigid node, I will draw normal to this surface. So this thing will kind of come off the surface and it'll replicate the banana's shape. And this will become clear. There, you can kind of see them. They're faint, but now with these, if I move these into position over here, so now they look about right. I've drawn them nearby and I've slid them into place. Let's set them also to immovable. And then lastly, you could come up along here and maybe just intersect a handful of spheres. That could make some sense. I decided that I didn't need it, and what's most important is just getting something to approximate these leaves up here. And so with those, I said physics. I want a plane collider, and I'm going to draw them on this. They're pretty much at this plane right here, kind of on this line. And so if I draw against right here, I'll draw out a square that's basically normal to and in parallel to that kind of slope. And so advanced construction technique, right now, all the transforms are kind of in respect to global, so they rotate on the global X, Y, and Z. But now that I've drawn an object like this, one of the things you may want to do is rotate it relative to itself, like along its own axis. And to do that, you can toggle into that pressing L. So L transforms the frame from global to local. And that'll become clear as you start to manipulate these things, because now I rotate this along its own axis, not the world axis. And that can become really helpful. You'll want to make sure that you know to toggle in and out of local. If you do things in local and you do it with many objects, Simmetri will warn you if your transform frame is set to local and you multi-select, that you may encounter manipulating some objects, and that'll end up looking weird. Because they'll all move in their own local direction, and that's a strange thing to control. So if we're in local, we can kind of rotate this, move it. I'm using Control to toggle between move and rotate. And just remembering I'm in local. Now I'm going to clone one using Alt. And I'm going to drag it off, bring it over to here. Try to bring it into position on this next one. It's to rotate along its axis. Pretty good. Maybe I'll tip it down a bit more. Oh. There we go. And I'm going to use world transformation on this one, see if that's a little easier. Holding down control, you don't want to rotate. Back to local transform, rotating it along its own axis. Seems pretty good. Okay. And last one. Not bad. Local, push it into position. Great. This is exactly what I want. I think that I didn't copy that one. I think I just moved one from that position. Let's do this one more time. So I'm leaving just a little bit of like the spine showing. I think that kind of makes sense. Kind of riding down the middle of them. Okay, so now that we have all of our objects, all of our colliders in place, what we're going to do is fuse them together into one object. So it's to select, basically, I'm going to delete this one. This is nothing. So this is the trunk. These are the bananas themselves. These are the approximators of the leaves. We're going to select the bottom one, hold down Shift and select the top one for a multi-select. And then we're going to press Control D. Control D fuses them all into one thing. And this is basically the banana tree, rigid node. And then we're going to make sure that that rigid body is not movable. Set it to false. And now when our character comes into collision with it, it's not slow. It's not slowed down the way that it was when you saw it earlier, because now it just collides really simply with a plane and with a sphere, and now you could clone this object away. So the last thing I would recommend is basically you're going to want to nest your mesh, your visual mesh, which is called banana tree, underneath the rigid body node, and call that what it called, system called it node. Select that and rename it to banana. Name it kind of your top level kind of organizational name, and then under here, what you had called banana tree, call it banana tree mesh. So you know, oh, this is the visual mesh item that has my material on it. That I can change if I want to change its visual properties. I will change those under the mesh here, and if I want to change its physical properties, I'll change that. I'll change those here, and this gets you around that issue that we saw in the beginning of having physical objects kind of colliding with this and sucking up a ton of compute power, installing the computer. You'll notice how unrealistic that right there actually looks, but that's partly because this guy is a convex hole that goes from that point to this point. And however, if you were to make this guy immovable, somebody else would collide with him. Into those spaces. there you go. That's a bit more about colliders on mesh models and kind of how to build your own. And yeah, in fact, last thing I'll say is that this could be, if you wanted, could now be usefully movable if you wanted, for some reason, if this was not, a tree and was like, a grappling hook or something that you wanted to throw. Goes right through them. There we go. Now we're gophering. Anchor. Gophers are pretty massive. There we go. Now we're catching gophers. All right. Those are kind of the fun things you can do with rigid bodies on models, and with these convoluted ones, you need a different strategy. So I'm going to make an island and catch you in another tutorial.